Hello everyone, and welcome to this final part of our lectures for this week. We are now asking the question about whether pressure groups enhance or threaten democracy. And this is our final video on this topic. And so the idea is that everything we've learned so far builds up to this particular debate. So before watching this video, you really need to be comfortable with what a pressure group is, what the different types of pressure group are, what a think tank is, what the methods are that they use, why some are successful and why some aren't successful, and to have a kind of range of case studies running through your minds. And with all of those kind of ideas in mind, including things like lobbying scandals, we should now be able to discuss whether in fact pressure groups are good for our country and they make democracy better, or whether they are bad for our country and in some way they kind of infringe the ability for us to make decisions. And one of the key terms for us to think about here comes from our first week, which is when we looked at the term pluralist democracy, the idea that power is spread out and with multiple different viewpoints and with lots of different competing ideas. Do pressure groups help that, or do they in some way hurt that? And we're going to start off by making the argument to say that pressure groups are good and that they benefit democracy. And then we will look at the argument to say that they don't. And then, of course, you can be the judge of which side is stronger. The first argument to say that they're good is that they disperse power. Rather than the power being purely in the hand of a dictator or a single president or a prime minister, the ideal is that you disperse power into a legislature. And then perhaps maybe into local government as well, like the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh government, and maybe into local representatives as well, such as a local councillor or maybe a local mayor. And the argument goes that the more you disperse power amongst different groups, organizations, politicians, public figures, the better, because it allows for more democracy, more competing viewpoints, and more ideas. Now, obviously, pressure groups do not have political legal power, but they do have soft power and they have influence and they have the ability to communicate with the public and to educate the public and to influence the way we think, which then in turn influences politicians. So having a large amount of pressure groups disperses power amongst lots of different organizations and gives more chance for different views to be heard. They also play an extremely important role in educating the public. And the example I've used here is global warming. Thanks to groups like Greenpeace, Extinction Rebellion, although that's a newer organization, but groups like that, we as a species are far more aware of the problems that global warming is causing and can cause, and how our future is kind of linked to what happens with it. And so pressure groups can play an important role in bringing to the public's attention things that we need to know or that we are not aware about. And so that's an environmental organization, but it could also be something like a human rights organization saying, did you know this group of people are having their human rights abused? It could be a fairness organization in some way that talks about discrimination in the UK. But when you receive a leaflet or you watch an advert on TV from a pressure group, the first thing it's doing is telling you, hey, there's a problem, there's an issue that you need to know about. The third way that pressure groups can enhance our democracy is that they give opportunities for us to participate. Now, you should be aware from our reading over the last couple of weeks that Britain is possibly suffering from a participation crisis. We don't join political parties. We don't have a great voting turnout, although it's not appalling. We don't vote in local elections and things like that. We rarely vote in referendums unless it really captures the public's imagination like the Brexit ones did. But we do tend to get involved in pressure groups. Let me give you a little factoid here. A really nice example that I think is a really good one for you to use in an essay. Article from The Guardian here, 1 in 10 UK adults are now involved in an environmental pressure group, figures show. So that could be Greenpeace, it could be Fracked Off, it could be Extinction Rebellion, as I mentioned, and it gives some figures here. Nearly 4.5 million people, or 1 in 10 UK adults, is now a member of a supporter of Britain's environmental and conservation groups. Now that is in contrast to perhaps the 1 in 50 or 1 in 100 adults that are actually a member of a political party. So do you remember it was like almost down to about 1% of the population that are members of a political party, although it's gone up again slightly recently. But this is more like 10%. And yes, granted, that's still not 50% or 60% or 80% or 90%, but it's better. As a group, we are more involved in pressure groups than we are in political parties. And this is just the environmental groups. This doesn't include trade unions, the CBI, moral issues such as euthanasia and abortion, sectional business-related groups like medical groups and so on. This is just one angle. So by the time we could make an educated guess that perhaps it's 1 in 5 are involved in a pressure group of some kind. But let's use the 1 in 10 statistic as we have it there. So really, pressure groups do give us a way to participate, which is outside of voting, because let's be honest, that's only once every 5 years anyway, outside of running for office, which very few people do, and outside of lobbying and getting politically involved that way. It gives a wonderful way for us to get involved on specific issues that we care about. Pressure groups also play an important role in protecting minorities. And so I've used the image here of Stonewall, which is a gay rights and transgender rights organization, but I equally could have used Black Lives Matter, or I could have used the NAACP from America, or there's probably others that I can't quite bring to mind now, but pressure groups have been very important both historically and now in terms of bringing to the public's attention the rights or the discrimination that certain groups suffer from, and working to bring justice to those people, or to bring equality through a variety of different methods, such as taking the government to court and using the Supreme Court, or going on protests, as you can see here in the picture, or even just raising awareness, again bringing us back to education about what some people are going through. And lastly, on this side, they can be also call the government to account, and that could be legally through a court case, or it could be simply through exposing what the government is doing and the impact of it. So I'll give you 2 examples here. One is an example we've used before, which is the Gina Miller case, when Gina Miller, who was a member of an interest group and a pressure group, took Theresa May's government to court over the Brexit negotiations. And she took the government to court, and the Supreme Court ruled that Theresa May's government had to send all of their kind of paperwork and their bills and their acts through Parliament rather than doing it on their own. We talked about that in a previous video, in a previous lecture, so go read up that example if you're not sure what I'm talking about there. But there's an example of where the Supreme Court is used to prevent the government from doing it, and a pressure group is involved in helping to bring that case to account. But here is Marcus Rashford, and as I've talked about in these videos, he's been very involved in helping young people to get free school meals during the coronavirus epidemic. And he called into account the fact that the government was stopping funding these meals, and was saying, look, you've got to do this. This is going to affect young people. This is going to affect their nutrition. The government mustn't do this. And so he kind of called them to account publicly using the media, talking about what the effects of the government's decisions would be. So far we've built up a really good and pretty strong case to say that pressure groups are effective and they enhance democracy. And this would be an essay that you could write using these arguments, using the examples that I've given, showing why these are strong arguments. You could make this case. But this is one of those nice topics where I think actually there is a strong argument on both sides. This argument probably has more, this side of the argument is possibly slightly easier to make, but this side of the argument is definitely valid. And the first argument against pressure groups is, and you'll see some opposites here, like, so we're starting with dispersing power, which means power is being spread everywhere. But the counter argument is that pressure groups are actually quite elitist. And elitism is the idea that power is concentrated in a special few, an upper class or a ruling class or a certain amount of individuals. And I've put another little phrase here that you might have come across, which is the Westminster bubble. And some people argue that pressure groups, despite having a wide membership, in fact, are only run by a rather select group of people who tended to go to private schools or grammar schools, or tend to live in London and work within the Westminster bubble. And actually, pressure groups don't really spread power out nearly as much as it first seems. And one example that you could use here are think tanks, which has been our other big topic for today's video. Now, I think think tanks do a really good job, but they don't necessarily spread out, disperse power in a democratic way. They tend to be private organizations that are privately funded, and they definitely work within the Westminster bubble. So they're very London centric and very kind of focused, and they definitely aren't kind of open and bringing in ideas from kind of all over the country amongst all different types of people. And I'm not saying think tanks are elitist. That would be a very emotive phrase to use. But I am saying that this pressure groups are perhaps more selective in who is involved than they may first seem. The second thing, and this perhaps counters educating the public, pressure groups have a goal and they are biased, whether they are environmental or social or moral or whatever, and they will often twist facts to make things look better or worse than in fact they are. And so an example here might be the famous bus during the Brexit campaign that said, we send the EU £350 million a week, let's fund our NHS instead. That was a distorted fact that had a grain of truth in it, but you had to use the facts and the figures in a very specific, weird way to get to that figure. And it's widely been called dishonest. And all pressure groups do something like this, maybe not something as dishonest maybe as that, but all pressure groups will pick out certain statistics and not others and say, did you know that this group of people are discriminated against? Or did you know that this amount of the environment is impacted, or whatever it might be? Pressure groups will distort information to make their case. Thirdly, pressure groups do give opportunities to participate, but they're undemocratic. And let me give you two ways to argue this. Firstly, they are rarely internally demographic, meaning that the people that run these groups don't tend to be elected by the organizations themselves. They tend to be jobs or appointed. So they're not. And so that phrase internally democratic means that they don't tend to vote for the leaders and the representatives within the pressure groups. And the second way that they are undemocratic is that many pressure groups are selective in who actually belongs to them anyway. So we talked last week about types of pressure group. And do you remember that some pressure groups only represent the people that are, what's the phrase? I always lose my words here, but some of them are, I can't remember the word. Sectional. Some of them are sectional and only represent certain sections of society. So, for example, the CBI here only represents business. The trade union, the teachers union, only represents teachers. And of course, we can argue this is a good thing. Of course, we can argue this is a good thing because it looks out for particular groups or perhaps particular minorities. You can see it here over my shoulder. But it also means that each group isn't necessarily kind of democratic and accountable, and everyone can't access every group. And certain groups might have more power and less power because of the amount of money that they have, which of course leads me to the fact that when it comes to pressure groups, money talks. Now, the opposite perhaps here is the idea that it protects minorities. Pressure groups can do wonderfully inclusive things that help a huge amount of people. But think about the lobbying and the lobbying scandals, is that also the truth is that pressure groups that have money are able to buy influence or to be heard more or able to fund professional lobbying firms, to use the example from earlier in the week, to make their case more strongly. And this perhaps, if I was going to make the case that pressure groups are problematic, I'd probably use this distort information one, and I'd probably use this money idea. Because I think you can then go into this lobbying scandals that we've talked about this week and really kind of show that there is a problem here with sometimes how pressure groups act. And building on that point, pressure groups sometimes use illegal actions. And I've got a picture here of what's called the Occupy movement, which was an organization that literally occupied London a couple of years ago to protest against forms of capitalism and to protest against austerity cuts. And they deliberately caused problems. They got in the way, and they tried to shut down traffic in various places, and eventually the police had to remove them. As part of the Extinction Rebellion protest last year, they sprayed buildings with what was supposed to look like, I think, animal blood. You may have seen that in the Black Lives Matter protests from in the summer. Most people on those protests were legal and fine, but there were some rioting and some looting. And there, if you go back historically, there's all sorts of actions that pressure groups have done involving animal rights organizations have actually attacked people that work in animal testing. And there are other examples. So you could make an argument that say that the methods that pressure groups use are not democratic. Obviously, if they're writing a petition, that's fine. If they are working within the system, then that is fine. But there are other actions that they take which can be seen as anti-democratic because they do not follow the laws that the rest of us have to follow. So if I just move myself to one side here, what do you think? Which side is the stronger case? Do they enhance democracy? Do they threaten democracy? Is the truth somewhere between the two? How might you reform the system to make them purely a good feature of our democracy, and what are your concerns? So be prepared to debate this, be prepared to write essays on this. I hope I've given you lots of case studies that you can use to make a really good essay. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I'll see you for our next topic, looking at rights.